3 and verse 17. So why do you think that they may have been given this nickname? What?
Speak out a lot.
Maybe they speak out a lot, okay, so kind of thunderous and they're very, very vocal, I guess you might say, okay. Why else do you think this might have been a nickname?
Maybe Zebedee's nickname was Thunder.
Maybe Zebedee's nickname? Okay. So maybe it's the sons of him and he was kind of a thundery fellow. All right. Yeah, maybe so. So that's interesting. Good. They could be a little hot-tempered, and I think we're going to see that in one of the instances that we notice. Perhaps it has something to do with their temperament, that they were a little fiery sometimes. Do you get the feeling when you read, for example, the Gospel of John and 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, though, that John was a very thundery type of guy? Because when I read John, I just think, well, this guy's got it all together. But I think that's one of the beauties of it. If they were hot-tempered people, it's amazing the type of guy that John became. Because he seems to be someone who writes the most often about love and emphasizes that and what it means to love God and what it means that God loves us. And so it's wonderful to think that even though who knows, maybe we did get a nickname while we were younger, maybe eventually we can outgrow it someday and become more of who God calls us to be. So let's think a little bit about these two men, James and John. They're both sons of Zebedee, and that's something that you see mentioned several times. So Zebedee must have been a character that was somewhat well known, at least to the gospel writers, because Matthew mentions him in 3 different passages. Mark mentions him. He's mentioned in Luke. He's mentioned in John. So it's oftentimes mentioned that they were sons of Zebedee. And I want to ask you a question, because what I want to do a little bit here is maybe break down some of a stereotype that we might have about James and John, and especially about them as fishermen. I think the general stereotype, and I've heard people say this, and I've probably said it at some point, that because they were fishermen, they were poor. What do you think about that? Are they ever called poor in Scripture? James, John, Peter?
No, they refer to their hired servants.
Okay, yeah. If you read Mark chapter 1 and verse 20, it would indicate that Zebedee was at least wealthy enough to have hired servants. If you look at verse 20, it says, immediately he called them, and they, that's James and John, who were the sons of Zebedee, they were mending their nets. They left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants. So it's not like they just pick up and leave their boat and leave their nets and all their equipment there. No, they left their father and they left all the hired servants and they went and followed Jesus. But the fact that he has hired servants indicates perhaps to you that just because they're fishermen doesn't mean that they're not wealthy. And I think that's the stereotype sometimes. Well, Jesus just picked poor fishermen to follow him. I don't know if I would say that they're poor. If you want to say that they were uneducated, I think you can say that because Acts chapter 4 calls them uneducated. So if you want to say that, I think that'd be fair to say. But I'm not sure if it's scriptural or right to say that just because they're fishermen, they're poor. Sometimes we have this mentality or this built-in bias because somebody works with their hands and gets dirty doing their job, that means they're poor. There's some dirty jobs out there and they make pretty good money. And it may have been that these fishermen were making pretty good money. I'm going to show you something in a minute that's just a bit of a historical note that indicates that Zebedee may have been a little more well-known and a little more well-to-do than perhaps we realize. And so this is a quote from Barclay's book, The Master's Men. He says this, in John 18, 15 and 16, another unnamed disciple appears in the gospel narrative. When Jesus was arrested, Peter and this unnamed disciple followed to see what would happen. And they were able to gain an entry to the courtyard of the high priest's house because this unnamed disciple was known to the high priest. John's acquaintance with the high priest may be explained in 2 ways. And so he's going to give you 2 alternatives based upon a couple of historical notes as to why. John's acquaintance, what was known. It says, number one, there is extant a letter written by Polycrates, who was the bishop of Ephesus about AD 190. And in it, he describes John as a witness and a teacher who reclined upon the bosom of the Lord and who was a priest and wore the priestly diadem. Well, that's interesting because perhaps John was a priest and therefore he was known to the household of the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. So that's one option that Barclay's offering. A little detail that we don't find in the text, but you do find it in some historical notes. It says, secondly, though, the second option as to why John was known and why John seems to have kind of an inside access to the high priest house is this. It may be that the second explanation is the more probable. H.V. Morton, in the Steps of the Master, gives us some very interesting information. He says, there is in the back streets of Jerusalem a dark little hovel, now I believe an Arab coffee house, which contains stones and arches that were once part of an early Christian church. The Franciscan tradition is that this church was erected on the site of a house which had belonged to Zebedee. Zebedee's the father of St. John. And this family, said the Franciscan, were fish merchants of Galilee. Now that would make sense with the gospel narrative, right? Zebedee's sons, they were fish merchants. And it says, this family, said the Franciscan, were fish merchants of Galilee with a branch office in Jerusalem, from which they used to supply, among others, the family of the high priest. Especially if you consider Jewish culture, that makes sense in Jewish culture because Jewish culture wants to buy from other Jews. And so who would they want to buy their fish from? Well, they want to buy their fish from some fishermen who have a branch office or a market, if you will, down in Jerusalem, buying their fish. That, he goes on to, he says, this would explain how John was known to the doorkeeper of the high priest's house. And it would also explain how Zebedee's fishing business was prosperous enough to employ hired servants. So this stereotype that sometimes I think we've had, that the fishermen were poor fishermen, when you actually know a few things in history, that may not be an accurate stereotype. I just want you to kind of notice that. And maybe that's why Zebedee gets mentioned. He's known. Everybody knows who Zebedee is. And therefore his sons also are people of influence as well, because they've got connections. They're selling fish to people down in Jerusalem who are of high rank. So, interesting historical note, I think, to think about. Well, let's think about James, first of all. We're going to start with him. James, the son of Zebedee, who's mentioned in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 2 in the listing of the first 12 apostles. First of all, let's think about this. What was he willing to do in order to serve Jesus? Look at Matthew 4, 21 and 22. Does anybody want to read Matthew 4, 21 and 22 for us?
Going on from there, he saw two of the brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him.
Okay. So what's he willing to do?
Leave his job.
Leave his job. Leave his father. Leave his job. That takes some sacrifice. Dad, I know you got a pretty good fishing business going on here, but there's a pretty amazing person named Jesus here that we've gotten to know a little bit about, and we're going to follow him. He's asking us to follow him. He's wanted to make us fishers of men. He's got a higher calling for us.
He was leaving the income for his family.
He was leaving income, leaving his family. Yeah. So what does our level of sacrifice indicate about our commitment?
The greater the sacrifice, the greater the commitment.
Greater the sacrifice, the greater the commitment. It says something about you when you're willing to sacrifice for something that's important to you. And I think that just by itself, before we move on to other points, is exemplary when you think about James and when you think about John. We don't know anything else about the situation other than he's willing to leave his dad and he's willing to leave behind his business if that means following Jesus. And that That's something that we need to consider. How serious are you about following Jesus? Well, if you're not willing to sacrifice anything for the sake of following Jesus, because you're committed to him more than anything else, are you really that committed to him? This was a major sacrifice that James made. And so we learned that first. Andy, you had a hand up?
I don't want to point out in verse 22, just the time frame of how long it took them to make this decision. If you think about it, you're going to make a great decision like this of leaving your family, leaving this business, leaving everything behind. You would take some time to consider it. But in verse 22, the first word is immediately they left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus calls them, and there seems to be no hesitation there. They follow him. Now, take a look at John 1 for a moment. And it seems to be, when you look at John chapter 1, that there was this period of time where Jesus had already gotten to know some of these apostles, right? For example, when you read John chapter 1 and verse 35, John is with two of his disciples. He points to the Lamb of God. The two disciples heard him speak and they followed Jesus. And then Jesus turned and seeing them, this is John 1 verse 38, following, said to them, "What do you seek?" They said to him, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" He said, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying. They remained with him that day. And one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. So Jesus, because we could say the same thing about Peter. Peter left his nets and followed Jesus. But did Peter do that immediately? Peter got to know Jesus a little bit. At least we see an indication of that in John chapter 1, that he got to know Jesus a little bit. It's a little far-fetched to think Jesus could just walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, follow me." And they just get up and follow him without some sort of previous acquaintance. And I think that's key. But the more you get to know Jesus and who he is and what he's about and what he can do, when Jesus says, "Follow me," and you realize the authority that he holds and who he is, because you trust him as a person, you're willing to give up anything for the sake of following him. And I think that's just one of the basic lessons we learn from James and John. Any more thoughts there? Take a look at Matthew 10. If you guys don't have anything, look at Matthew 10. And I just want to remind you of verses 34 through 37. Because it's, I think, exemplary to see that James is willing to leave his father. That's probably a harder decision than maybe we realize. If you're in a family business, all right, and I speak from personal experience here because I have a family that has a family business, and two of my brothers work for the family business. And when you decide not to work for the family business, there's a little pressure there. It can be a big deal to be the one that doesn't work for the family business when that's just all kind of been laid out for you. But Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34 says this: "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." We think sometimes of Jesus as preaching this to other people, right? That this is a message that other people need to hear. Who's he preaching it to? Well, all of us, but I want you to think about Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, what is that about? It's the 12. Do you think James and John maybe needed to hear this message? That, hey, I know that you want to be loyal to Zebedee, your father, because he's got a good fishing business, and there's a temptation maybe to go back to that, but you need to love me and take up your cross and follow me and not go back to that. And so he may very well be preaching to his own apostles where that is a temptation for them, and calling them to stay committed to the cause and not go back to where it's easy and where there was more money, if you will. Easier lifestyle, certainly. You're not going to get the persecution. If you look at Matthew 10, the context before this is all about the persecution you're going to face as disciples. And yet you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me. It'd be easy to go back to fishing. You're not going to get persecuted there. but I want you to take up your cross and follow me. So he may very well be talking to his own apostles when he says this, and it's a lesson that we learn from what he's saying to them. John MacArthur says this in 12 Ordinary Men. He's talking about the disposition of James. He says, what little we know about James underscores the fact that he had a fiery, vehement disposition. While Andrew was quietly bringing individuals to Jesus, James was wishing that he could call down fire from heaven and destroy whole villages of people. And we're going to see that in the text in a minute. So even the fact that James was the first to be martyred, and that his martyrdom was accomplished by a figure no less than Herod, suggests that James was not a passive or a subtle man. Rather, he had a style that stirred things up so that he made deadly enemies very rapidly. There is a legitimate place in spiritual leadership for people who have thunderous personalities. Elijah, Nehemiah, John the Baptist. James apparently was cut from similar fabric. He was outspoken, intense, and impatient with evildoers. And again, we're making this point with every apostle, God still used him. We try to put everybody into a perfect cookie cutter mold that this is what you have to be like. God can use different people with different personalities and different skill sets, and he can use them for his glory. And we learned that about James. These are just a few instances. I went ahead and wrote them out because I didn't think we really needed to go to every single one of these passages. But notice the many times James is mentioned alongside Jesus. Luke 5, Jesus calls Peter, James, and John to discipleship. I will make you fishers of men, he tells them in verse 10. And so James and John are there. Mark 1:29, Jesus goes into Peter's house, he heals his mother-in-law, but James is also listed as being there. Luke 8:51, Jesus heals Jairus' daughter with Peter, James, and John. So James and John are witnesses of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law and of Jairus' daughter. Matthew 17, Jesus is with Peter, James, and John being transfigured. So there's only 3 apostles who get to be special witnesses of the transfiguration, and Peter, James, and John are those 3. Matthew 26:37, Jesus is at Gethsemane. And again, it's the inner circle. We sometimes refer to them as the inner circle of the apostles, but it's Peter, James, and John who are there at Gethsemane. Mark 13, Jesus at the Mount of Olives. Same basic idea with Peter, James, John. Andrew is also mentioned. Luke 9:52, Jesus is journeying through Samaria with Peter, James, and John. Now let's read that text while we're there, because that's going to come back up here in a second. Luke 9 and verse 52. Oh, back up to verse 51. Luke 9 and verse 51. Came to pass, well, let's back up 2 more verses. Back up to verse 49. Luke 9 and verse 49. John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow with us. So notice he's casting out demons, being successful, doing it in the name of Jesus. But John says, we told him to quit doing it because he's not part of us. He's not in our group. And Jesus said, do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side. Verse 51. Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. So that's Jesus headed to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? Now, to me, if there's any passage that connects James and John to the sons of thunder, this is it right here. Let's blow this place up, all right? Let's send thunder and lightning, and let's blow up this village. How dare they disrespect you, Jesus? So let's blow it up. And Jesus says, in verse 55, he rebukes them and says, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. The Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to another village. Jesus just says, no, I don't think we're going to blow up any villages today. Let's just move on to the next one. But that's interesting. It's interesting. It shows you their fiery disposition there. But that's one of the times that James and John are with Jesus there. And then, of course, when Jesus appears on the lakeside in John chapter 21, in that bridge between, that really bridges Peter's denial to Peter's affirmation of Jesus, Jesus appears and James and John are there. A simple lesson I want you to learn from this. If we want to be close to Jesus, and we really want to be someone who really knows Jesus, how important is it to be near him when he is preached and when he is taught and when his people are together? And that's one of the simple lessons that I think we need to learn from James and John, just their presence at all of these major moments, whether it be moments of victory like the Transfiguration, or even moments where they needed to be rebuked by Jesus. The fact that they were with Jesus, it was good for them to be there. They saw Jesus at his very best, and Jesus saw them at their very worst. And they learned something from every one of those occasions. And the same is true when we're gathered together and we assemble and we hear preaching that sometimes puts us on the mountaintops, and we leave just enthralled and excited and ready to serve. And sometimes preaching that's hard and shows us who we really are on the inside and things that we need to change. It's going to be good for you, whether it's preaching that is encouragement or preaching that is rebuke. It's going to be good for you to hear more about what Jesus thinks. Every time you come together, you're going to grow closer to Jesus. I think that's a simple lesson we learn from James and John. What thoughts do you have on that? I'll let you guys preach for a minute. Kind of getting on my soapbox a little bit here.
I want to go back to how, like I said, they left their family business behind and followed Jesus. That also had an effect on the family business of they're giving their father's business a bad reputation because they're following Jesus, and Jesus is doing all these things, and they're causing Jews, Pharisees, problems, and so that could easily hurt the father's business and, affect his reputation. So it wasn't just, their own reputation, but it was affecting their family's reputation. And this is through their action with following Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point, Andy.
I think that goes back to, what are you committed to? We read Hebrews 10:24, and that verse has been a lot of times, I don't want to say taken out of context, but people will hammer, don't forsake the assembly, right? As a box you have to check. But really, that just shows what you're committed to. What are you wanting to have your time centered around? And it doesn't necessarily have to be, the assembly all the time, but are you around spiritual things? Because if you're a Christian, it should be easy for you to want to be around. Forget just checking the assembly box. It should be easy for you to be around Jesus and his things because you want to be more like him. And we see James, as one of his apostles, exemplifying that.
Yeah, good thoughts. Russell?
It keeps you, focused. They were constantly around the Word. It kept them focused on the thing they needed to. If we miss and we're around things that are not what we should be focusing on and the Word, it's going to water us down. It's going to take you away, and you're not going to be a son of thunder in the right way. Or you're just not. You're going to be influenced by everyone else, as opposed to being influenced to those that want to make you better.
Good.
Think of what all they would have missed if they had not been there.
I think that's key. I mean, you're supposed to be the witnesses, the eyewitnesses of Jesus. So you got to be with Jesus if you're going to do a good job of explaining Jesus to other people. And that's why we need to be in the Word. That's why we need to be around the Word when it's preached and using every opportunity that we can to get teaching, because the more we absorb and sponge, the more natural it's going to be for us to share that with other people, what we learn and what we know. I like what Clay said. It's not a box to be checked. It's like when Jesus said, "Follow me." That's a command. Yeah, you should do it because Jesus told you to do it. Why do you want to do it? You want to do it because this is the guy that just told you to throw your net over on the other side of your boat after you caught nothing, and then you just brought in a multitude of fish that you couldn't haul in, because now you've learned what Jesus can do for you and who Jesus is. You want to follow him and get to know him now. And so if we want to know Jesus, we want to be with his people, we want to hear his word preached, and we want to share that with other people too. Pat?
I was reading today on Facebook, post by Church of Christ ladies. The discussion was, why is it so many churches these days get upset when people do not want to come back on Sunday night and on Wednesday night? And I would say probably 90% of the discussion there was coming in favor of coming less. And it really hurt to see that. I've lived enough years that meetings when I was a child, were 2 weeks. And people went every night and just hungered to hear more and more of something. And I look forward to coming Sunday night, Wednesday night, because we learn something every time we come. We may forget it tomorrow because we're old, but we do learn something even at our age. And it's exciting for us to be with the Christians and to see them sit around after services are over for an hour. Some even more than that because I've left.
Yeah.
But yet there's so many that don't feel that way. And you give them the scriptures, seeking God first, and him being most important in your life, but it just doesn't seem to seek in. And I don't know how to help that.
Yeah, I think the question is, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't get into this conversation, but I think the question is, what's your motivation? Do you want to do less for the Lord because is it selfishly motivated because it's all about you and what you want to do? What's the motivation behind why we're doing what we're doing? I think that's a key question that we have to ask when we think about, well, should we have a 2-week gospel meeting? And should we go 4 days? Should we have a Sunday night service? What's your motivation for it? And if my motivation is spiritual growth and getting to know Jesus better, and I think whatever decisions we make that are a yes to that are going to be good decisions.
What if we put it at our job? Do we get to choose if we're going to go to work today or if we're not?
Some people think they can. They usually get fired. But
I mean, I'm saying some people would not miss work or
mm-hmm.
anything, but they would not hesitate to miss church service.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, this is their job too, that you're trying to work hard to get together. We need to do everything God tells us to get there. We need to be with Christians and we're moving from the world.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think it's all about love. If my grandchildren were gonna be somewhere and I had the opportunity to go, I'm gonna go as many times as possible because I just wanna be around them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I love them.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And I've tried to rephrase how I say things. I'll give you an example. This is not a church service example, but I thought this was something that happened back when I was in Anderson. We had a couple of handicapped people that had come from a nursing home, and they didn't have a ride, and so somebody had to give them a ride. Well, the guy that was giving them a ride, his car was busted, and he was having health problems, so he couldn't give them a ride anymore. So we needed people to go give him a ride. And naturally, it's hard to get people sometimes to give somebody a ride. It's a long drive to go pick them up, long drive to bring them back. And I think a lot of people try to beat that heart that, hey, they have to assemble, we have to do this because it's a command. And one of our elders, he actually did it. He gave an announcement, and I thought it was great the way he said it. He said, you know what? The Bible calls us to love. And we should love these people, and they love God, and they want to serve God. And because they love God and because we love them, I'm asking you to do this out of love. I love how he switched the approach when he did that, because he made it not about do it because this is the rule. Do it because the rule is love. And love wants to do what God calls us to do. And to me, it's the same issue when it comes to attendance and the things like that we're talking about. I want to do it because I love God. I love Jesus. And if I haven't convinced someone to be here every time they can, to listen to the word and to listen and to worship him, then maybe we haven't done a good enough job helping people understand why you should love him and how much he loves you. And so I've kind of changed my approach to that a little bit in the last few years.
About John and James, but how it kind of ties into some of these things we're talking about. Here in Luke, they call fire down. It says James and John call fire down from heaven in just a short period of time. In Acts chapter 8, John's going to lay hands on Samaritans to give them the gift of the Holy Spirit. That prejudice had gone away.
Good thoughts, guys. You were just talking. I looked at the clock. I was like, I got 4 minutes left, and I'm on question 4. Look at this. Let's move on a little bit. James in Acts 12. What happens to him? He's killed. First martyr. What had perhaps James heard Jesus teach about in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount? What's that about? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And James is willing to do exactly what Jesus said we must be willing to do in his Sermon on the Mount. James had seen Jesus himself be persecuted to the point of death for the sake of pleasing the Father. And James emulates that. It's something I think we can learn from, something he learned by being around Jesus, being willing to suffer for the sake of the kingdom. Now, you look at some of the Sons of Thunder, there's some negative events. We already read Luke 9, and the negative event there is they want to blow up the Samaritan village. Mark 10, what's going on in Mark 10?
Look at the stage of sitting by his right and left.
Yep. Their mother comes along. That's kind of awkward when your mom gets involved, but their mother comes along, and mother wants James and John to sit at the right and the left hand of Jesus in the kingdom. So they're ambitious. It makes everybody angry. And then in Luke 9, they tell some people not to be in their circle. I'm just going to let MacArthur respond to those texts, and he writes about it very concisely here. He says, when James and John suggested fire from heaven as a fitting response to the Samaritans' inhospitality, they probably thought they were standing on solid precedent. After all, Elijah was not condemned for his actions. On the contrary, at that time and under those circumstances, it was the appropriate response from Elijah. But it was not a proper response for James and John. In the first place, their motives were wrong. Jesus' example taught James that loving kindness and mercy are virtues to be cultivated as much as, and sometimes more than, righteous indignation and fiery zeal. Brian Nash comments on the Luke 9, 49 and 50 passage. He says, James and John liked notoriety. And we see that attitude carried over in Luke 9, 49 and 50. It says, John answered, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name. We tried to stop him because he doesn't follow with us. Jesus said, do not stop him. For the one who's not against you is for you. John displayed an elitist attitude. Essentially said, you're not part of the 12. Leave that stuff to us. And some people would rather be powerful than productive. And this was the attitude of Diotrephes in 3 John. 3 John. He loved to put himself first. He loved to get the credit and the attention. And then MacArthur goes on to say the promise of thrones was what caught the attention of James and John. They were already in the intimate circle of the 3. They had been disciples as long as anyone. They probably thought of numerous reasons why they deserved this honor, so why not simply ask for it? In their foolish, ambitious self-confidence, they were clamoring for honor and position, so they were still eager to hear him promise them those highest thrones. Their ambition ultimately created conflicts among the apostles because the other 10 heard about it and were displeased. All right. John, I think you guys know the answer to this, right? Jesus trusts John to take care of his mother. Does that not say something about John's character? I don't know about you, but if I leave this earth first and somebody's got to take care of my mom or my wife, I'm going to find the very best person to care for them that I possibly can. And so that says something about John's character. He may have had his flaws, but Jesus trusts him so much he would trust him with his mother. And of course, John is mentioned several times in the book of Acts, right alongside Peter while Peter's preaching and while Peter's being persecuted. All right. There was one last quote I was going to touch on, but we didn't get to that. Next week, Tim's teaching again next week. I'll be preaching in Coleman, at South Coleman next week, Sunday through Wednesday. And so Tim is graciously my substitute this quarter, and so I appreciate him doing that. What are we studying next week, Tim? Is it Philip?